Hello, and welcome to the next video of Module 4, covering how journalists can reduce polarization and build trust. I'm Julia Hotz, a fellowships manager at the Solutions Journalism Network, and today we're joined by two special guests. Chris Green and Alexis Allison are both alumni of the Solutions Journalism Network's Complicating the Narrative Fellowship, an opportunity for journalists to report on solutions to some of the nation's most divisive issues with communities historically misrepresented by media and misunderstood by audiences. Calling in from Wichita, Kansas is Chris Green, executive editor of The Journal, a civic issues magazine published by the Kansas Leadership Center. Chris's project sought to complicate the debate around immigration and demographic change in the heartland and convene folks on all sides of the issue to foster a more productive dialogue on this topic. We're also joined by Alexis Allison, an independent journalist and teacher based in Fort Worth, Texas. Alexis's project with the Fort Worth Report involved creating a podcast, Health Story, in which two people who disagree about a health decision talk to each other and model how to talk about hard things in a helpful way. Immigration and health. It's hard to think of two issues that lend themselves more to a need to reduce polarization. So let's start from the beginning with you and these projects in your newsrooms and your communities. I'd love to understand why you and your newsroom decided to take on this project. What was the media landscape like? Chris, maybe let's start with you. What made you decide to focus on immigration?
We all know that immigration is one of the most polarizing issues out there. It divides Democrats and Republicans. We hear all about the debates going on in Congress. We hear about our lawmakers going down to the border to do some sort of staged photo op or something. But I was finding that immigration was having a profound impact in Kansas and Kansas communities. And no one was really talking about it. Kansas is a state that needs to grow in terms of population and grow economically. And we need immigrants to do that. But we also have these communities where if you bring in people from different backgrounds who speak different languages, who might have different values, making those things be cohesive is really hard. And so you have two competing values at the same time that communities need to reconcile. And I just didn't see anybody in Kansas trying to have a conversation about that, about the borders and dividing lines in our own backyards that needed attention.
That's so well said, Chris. And just practicing my looping here, it sounds like, yeah, immigration is this thing that gets talked about on national news. It's considered a national debate. But what your project, it sounds like, really tried to do was understand how this affects folks at home, within your community. And I want to come back to how you approached that, what came after that. But Alex, maybe let's move to you. Similarly, of course, health is something that affects all of us. What made you decide to choose that as the portal, as the focus of your project?
I think health is both deeply personal and deeply political. And as you said, Jules, everyone has a stake in it. More than that, though, I think the way that we think about our bodies and the way that we treat our bodies and each other's bodies is really informed by deep core values and core belief systems. And as try as we might, we try to distill health decisions and beliefs into little labels like I'm pro-life or I'm pro-choice, when really that decision is quite multi-layered. And I also think Texas is typically considered a bellwether state when it comes to certain pieces of legislation, and our policymakers seem to always be wrestling with abortion and gender-affirming care and whether or not to expand Medicaid and whether to provide subsidized care for people who are undocumented. And all of these issues are complicated and we have deeply rooted emotions surrounding them. And so I felt like health it felt like a natural issue to tackle, and B, I wanted to do it in an educational format, a podcast dialogue format that could model for people how to have these conversations well, because we're all having them in our families and our communities. And as a teacher, I think it's helpful if we have some good examples.
Absolutely. I loved what you said about not reducing our very complicated and layered feelings about health, not just to the both side, pro or anti. And of course, in listening to your podcast, it was so wonderful to hear the sources you picked, also pick up on that point. And actually, on that note, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how you decided, Alexis, to select sources for that podcast. But how did you think about modeling those conversations?
Okay, well, first I had to find people who were willing to publicly participate in a hard conversation about a very personal topic. And I really used a few methods. Word of mouth. I asked everyone I knew if there were people in their circles who might be interested in having these conversations publicly. And then I put call outs in stories and newsletters through the Fort Worth Report. And that's actually how I found, I think, both of the people in the first episode about abortion through this newsletter call out. And once I received their interest form, I contacted them, had a phone call just to see where they were coming from and sort of the spirit behind their wanting to participate. And for these two people, they were both really interested in moving the conversation forward and learning from someone else, which I think was key. And then in terms of more broadly setting up the interview structure, I felt like this topic, delving into a hard conversation publicly, is sort of akin to skydiving. I haven't skydove, but I would imagine that it feels like such a risky endeavor that you would want the company that you're going with to be as structured and as professional and safe as possible. And so I went with the path of researching organizations that were already having these conversations and trying to mimic their style, understanding their ground rules. I called the employees of a peacekeeping organization that I used to work with to brainstorm and workshop. I talked to our friend Chris here about his experience with StoryCorps and tried to create a fairly tight structure so that the two people going into this conversation could feel like they had life jackets on or parachutes, to keep with my former metaphor.
I absolutely love that metaphor. That is so, so key. And when folks listen to the conversation, they'll be able to hear that sort of baseline safety paying off. Even the headline itself, a physician and a reverend disagree on abortion, but not in the way that you might think, I think speaks to the deep, deep, thoughtful work you did to recruit characters who are both going to be curious and interesting and maybe not fall into those pro and anti camps that you described. And I definitely want to come back to, how you actually set up those conversations to ensure that. But let's also hear from Chris. You had an additional challenge of not just bringing together two people, but actually a representative group to come together to discuss this issue. You called them thought partners. Could you talk a little bit about the process of how you recruited those thought partners?
Yeah, one of the things we wanted to do with our project is like bring people of different viewpoints together to help us think through like what to cover and how to talk about the issue in a way that would speak to more sides than are currently engaged. And so we have a pretty diverse audience, both in terms of their politics and in terms of racial and ethnic demographics. And so we started with a survey that we sent out to our readership, and we got probably about 120 applications back where people answered a series of questions where they expressed their interest in the topic and sort of told us their story about immigration and what they wanted out of being a thought partner, and gave us some information about their political beliefs. They answered a series of questions about their views on particularly polarizing topics on immigration. And we even asked them who they voted for in the 2020 presidential election. And so that became like a real guidepost. Like we wanted this group to be roughly balanced in terms of their political intuition, and the Trump-Biden dynamic became a good shorthand. So political balance was important. We tried to get people geographically spread across our state from different contexts. We wanted the rural perspective. We wanted the urban perspective. We wanted people who had a story to tell about immigration. And so we really put a priority on finding immigrants on both sides of the political divide, either people who were immigrants themselves or had immigration stories within their first, second, third generations. And so we just tried to find this like balanced group that we would put together and kind of see what happened behind the scenes, because these were, unlike Alex's conversations, they eventually became public, but they very much started out in private. And we were going to pick something like 6, and we couldn't narrow it down that much. So we put together a group of 10 to participate in 4 90-minute sessions over the course of about 6 months.
Wow. Fantastic. And, once again, your headline, I think, speaks to that thoughtful work, becoming one out of many. And I think what's really admirable, in addition to the sort of political balance and the geographic balance, which sounds like is another form of, to use Alex's great metaphor, sort of putting on the life jacket so folks can go into this conversation feeling like, they're not going to be the token Trump voter. But that within that, you also, just like Alexis, managed to find really interesting and perhaps unexpected stories, that fall outside of what we might think a Trump voter or a Biden voter might think about immigration. And it strikes me that one of the techniques perhaps that you use to surface these stories is what, again, I'm trying to model right now, the technique of looping, which is fabulous. I mean, when we talk about teaching looping and teaching interviewing, we're really talking to journalists, but both of you managed to teach these techniques to your sources as well. And so, Chris, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what did that involve, teaching your sources, your participants, your thought partners, actually how to loop.
So when we started out, like we just started out having like big group discussions, and eventually like I owe a debt to Alex, like listening to her one-on-one conversations made me want to like adapt that idea to our context. And so we paired each of these thought partners up like with a person of sort of the opposite political perspective and had them do, I think it was 90-minute conversations with each other. And before we talked, like we wanted to see if we could get looping in the mix. So we just did like a 5-minute primer on looping, where I sort of took the 4 steps and outlined them. And then I used another staff member to sort of demonstrate it as like you might be doing here with us. And so we just did that quick 5-minute thing. And we went back and listened to the audio. All of them tried it once. The ask was for them at least to try it. And so many of them tried it multiple times. And so I don't think these skills are that difficult to learn if we just sort of like prime people to think about them. And I think they actually like really drove the conversation deeper. And so many of these thought partners, like this was the most memorable experience of their entire thing, was the chance to have a really meaningful conversation with someone who disagreed with them on a lot of things, but they found a lot of ways in which they could connect as human beings.
I love that feedback. That's so wonderful to hear. I've often said about both of your projects that both of them fostered dialogue that you just would not be able to find anywhere else. And to hear that folks really relished in the chance to loop, that it wasn't as difficult as we might make it out to be, is really, really refreshing. And same goes for you, Alex. I mean, in your conversations, in addition to the thoughtful prep work you did with recruiting, you also put together this wonderful discussion guide and had some questions that folks could actually ask during the conversation that might help with that more productive dialogue. Could you talk a little bit about what went into that guide and what went into the questions you decided to select for it?
Certainly. Like I said before, I did a lot of preliminary research about how I might create this guide because I knew that I wanted a lot of structure so that the people going in didn't feel like they'd been just left alone with each other. And I looked to mimic the model of StoryCorps. And then there's an organization called Braver Angels that's a nonprofit in New York that works toward political depolarization. So these other groups had already been working in this space long before I was, and I borrowed some of their model to create this back and forth dialogue. But after I had that structure in place, I wanted to really focus and lean on the 22 questions that complicate the narrative, partly because I knew they would create rich dialogue, but also because I wanted to publicize them further to the world and use them as a teaching model. And I started with questions like, why is this issue important to you? What life experiences have influenced your beliefs about this issue? Because I wanted to start with more of the sharing, a bit high level, and then move into some introspection for both speakers. How do you decide which information to trust, for example, requires a little bit of self-monitoring. And then I think one of the more climactic questions is, where do you feel torn? Is there any part of the other side's perspective that makes sense to you? Because that's, by that point in the conversation, I think people feel relatively comfortable with each other. They've shared a little bit of their life story. They've talked about how they have come to their conclusion on the issue. And this question, where do you feel torn, allows them to be, I think, at their most vulnerable and sharing any uncertainty. And as a journalist, I think I'm often encouraged. I think we're often encouraged to find the sound bites that are definitive. And I think the uncertainty is really beautiful because so many of us are uncertain about a lot of things, or at least I am. And then from there, I wanted to have the conversation move into more of I had it move into solutions journalism. They discussed a solution story. So then it became a little collaborative. They had shared some vulnerability, and then they were able to collaborate on thinking through, hey, would this approach that worked in a community elsewhere work for us in Tarrant County? And then afterward, I wanted them to reflect on the conversation. So one of the questions, and 22 questions that complicate the narrative, is, how do you feel talking about this or sharing this story? So I tweaked it to, how do you feel about this conversation after this conversation? And I think it allowed for a nice respite from some of the more difficult topics, and just some gratitude and self-reflection at the end.
Absolutely. And that feeling I think as a listener too is very shared. I think it's almost impossible to listen to that podcast or for Chris to read, the articles that have come out of your project and not feel a little bit more humbled and uncertain, as you put it, in a beautiful way. Especially that question, where do you feel torn? That was really, really beautifully done. And again, is probably a question that most of us don't have an opportunity to answer ever. And so to hear someone else ask it, I think that was like mission accomplished. You got me thinking about, where do I feel torn on this? And could I ask that question to someone? So bravo on that. So just wrapping this up, I want to come back to the big picture of these projects. You both came in with these goals. And I know as a listener and sort of a proud cheerleader, which moments stand out to me, what sticks with me. But I'm curious for both of you as journalists, which moments from the conversations stand out to you in terms of being particularly memorable in terms of building trust and complicating the narratives and reducing polarization? Chris, maybe let's start with you.
So I think there are three moments that really stand out for me. One is in the conversation between the thought partners, a woman from rural Kansas named Josie and a man from another part of Kansas, David. And David was an immigrant with a very harrowing immigration story and fleeing violence as a child. And it was how he came to this country. And to just hear him tell the story to Josie and like have her like realization and have her like connect with that story and just like thank him for sharing it was just this really beautiful, moving moment to listen to. And yet to also hear her like she both acknowledges like the importance of immigration and also like elevates like, well, what if these problems that people talk about really are real and how we like that the downsides of it do exist and that we have to acknowledge that part of the conversation. It was just like a wonderful moment. And then we just had a couple of really amazing community conversations where we brought together people in a community that has a lot of division, a growing Latino population, and not a lot of connection between those communities. And we were able to bring a group of people together in a Mexican restaurant to celebrate. And it had like everyone from legislators to members of the city council to a local Latino professionals group. And they actually got to sit in and talk, and they never would have been in that room but for us, like, sort of giving the excuse to do it. And we sort of took that up to another level in a community that was welcoming Afghan refugees. And so we orchestrated another collision of different cultures by working with a group of volunteers and Afghan refugees to host a block party where there was all of this Afghan food and music and culture. And these two communities came together to sort of like experience the complications that come when our narratives are in the same place at the same time, which is, I think, talking is great. And I think experiences can also be a way to sort of like force us to really see the complexity in life.
So beautiful, Chris, and really hearkening back to your original goal around helping people in your community see how this is an issue that affects people in your community. It sounds like you have definitely succeeded on that front. And that's the beautiful thing about storytelling, right? They stick with us. I mean, these projects now are almost a year old, 6 months old. I mean, the fact that both us as project facilitators, as journalists, and those sources will walk away with those stories for life, I think is really beautiful and speaks to our mission, not just as journalists trying to build trust and reduce polarization and complicate the narrative, but just as human beings trying to make it in this election year, especially. Alex, how about you? This conversation that we've been referencing today is just one of many that came from the Health Stories series. You've also gone on to, of course, influence a lot of other journalists and how they've approached their polarizing conversations. I'm curious what sticks out from you as the biggest successes from your project.
Like Chris, I think I have two or three from the conversations themselves. And as I referenced earlier, the question, where do you feel torn? In the first conversation ended with one of the participants saying that he didn't know. And in the next conversation, which was about gender affirming care, there was a similar moment where one of the participants said, I don't know how to speak to that. And I think the opportunity to publicly get to I don't know is really powerful. Again, it shows that there's a level of comfort and vulnerability and an acknowledgement that we don't have all the answers to these complex issues. And even if we have a firm stance that's well evidenced, we don't know everything about it. There are sides that we don't yet know. And I think that alone is very powerful. I also noticed at the end of the conversations a sort of letdown of shoulders and the acknowledgement from, I think, every participant that it wasn't as bad as they thought. It was easier than they thought. They came into the conversation with their barriers raised, and they were worried about the other side, because I think sometimes we think of the other side as this faceless internet mob, and this really personal one-on-one interaction where they had to sit across and see each other and watch each other's faces and responses and reactions, I think just reminded everyone that we're humans and we're all coming from a certain place, but we can talk to each other, and maybe we're not as scary as we think we are, or we think they are. So that was powerful. And then I haven't followed up with my second set of participants, but I know that at the end of the conversation, they were planning to meet each other for karaoke. So I'm curious if that actually happened. And I love that they created a relationship, or at least wanted to create a relationship as a result of a hard conversation. It was like they had both gone through something hard and brave, and they were bonded, even if they weren't fully on the same page.
I love that so much. What a beautiful hope that we can all have, right? Let's hope that by this time next year, everyone's, in karaoke bars together, mending their differences. And that's, I think, something really important that both of your projects taught me. It's not necessarily about agreement, but it's about understanding and reminders that we can disagree and we don't have to use another beautiful metaphor from you, Alexis, like keep our shoulders up as we do that. And I think it also taught me that often there aren't two sides. Often there's a lot of nuance and a spectrum. And I think both of your projects will add to a body of work demonstrating that. And so my final question for today is, I guess, advice you would have for other journalists looking to lead projects like this. Immigration, health, these are two really hot button issues this election cycle. But I feel that your techniques could actually apply to probably a lot of different issues. So I guess my question is, what advice would you give to other journalists who are looking to reduce polarization, whatever that polarization might look like in their communities? Chris, maybe let's start with you.
So I think Alex had some really wise advice earlier about just like if you're going to send people out to skydive, like make sure they have all the equipment and like everything is like you sort of set those conditions for trust. And while I would urge that, like I would also say like Alex actually went out and did it, and I worry it could be an excuse. And I think my advice is like difficult things can come up when you bring people of difference together, but really beautiful things can happen too. So consider that side of things. And if you do your prep work and you create the conditions for people to have a good conversation, you might really be amazed what can come out. I think as journalists, we have fears. Oh no, what if someone says something that's not true? What if like it's about misinformation? And if you can create things in a really structured way, you can probably account for those things. So you shouldn't let the dangers of doing this be an excuse for not doing it, because I don't know how we get people to connect, how we get people to be more informed, how we get people to move beyond the current status quo without having these kinds of conversations more often.
Beautiful. So well said. Such a timely reminder for folks listening to this during this year, especially. Alex, how about for you? Any advice you'd give, in addition to all the advice both of you have already given to journalists trying to reduce polarization in their communities?
This is a tough question, and I think I think it's because complicating the narratives is still an evolving approach in journalism. And I think I wrestle with whether there are ever stories that aren't complicated, and and is every story complicated? Jules, you just mentioned that not every story has two sides. Usually there are quite a few sides, but is there ever a time when, as journalists, we need to say or approach a story through the lens of one side only? And who am I to be the arbiter of what's complicated? And I decided that I like that I don't know. It feels apropos, but also what it's caused me to do is try to seek opinions of people that I trust and care about but disagree with. And I'm thankful to have a lot of those people in my life. And I think my hope for anyone attempting to complicate the narrative is just to continually be continuously know that you are still learning yourself, and it's going to be a lifelong journey, and you'll probably have to relearn lessons or unlearn lessons that you thought were great. and so to keep personally challenging yourself and your own narratives so that hopefully you can do right by the people that you're working with.
I love that. Beautifully said. And how about that? You modeling the answer, I don't know, right here for folks on this MOOC right now. That is beautiful. And how lucky we are to be joined by two journalists who truly practice what they preach. Chris and Alex, thank you so much for all of this wisdom that you passed on. Thank you, Knight Center, for tuning in. We will see you next time.